Hi, and welcome back. I'm going to look at the magic Death Eye compressors from DDMF today. And first of all, note that I'm using the demo version. Unlike in some previous videos, however, that doesn't mean I'm unconvinced. In fact, spoiler alert, I think these compressors sound glorious, and I'm definitely going to buy a license. I haven't yet, for a few reasons. First of all, I'm in no hurry until my new studio computer arrives in a week or so. Yes, my old one finally died. There will be a video about that, however, so I'll just say that I'm currently working on my laptop, and it sucks. So most of my work is on hold at the moment. Second, I haven't actually made up my mind which to buy. These are sold as two separate plugins, or as a bundle with a discount, and the pricing isn't quite low enough to make it a no-brainer impulse purchase. Especially in the same month I'm springing for a new computer, which also, by the way, means replacing all three of my displays and my audio interface at the same time. And third, I want to make a point about how much I dislike this periodic hissing style of demo. I know DDMF aren't the only developer to take this approach, and this version of it is relatively mild and inoffensive, but I would strongly encourage a time-limited but unrestricted demo instead, like you get with FabFilter plugins. The reason being, if I'd tried this demo on the mix bus while I was mixing this song, it would undoubtedly have stayed there, assuming it wasn't hissing at me, because it sounds great. I would have rendered my mix with it on, and then been almost obliged to buy a license. Anyway, I've already said it sounds great. Let's talk about why I think that first. Then I'll move on to a list of criticisms and feature requests. You didn't really think I wouldn't have any of those, right? First of all, there's some box tone and some saturation. Linear analysis shows very subtle shaping of the frequency response in the bass frequencies, which is interesting. It's not an obviously flattering response, but I like what I'm hearing from it, and it's gentle enough that I can't imagine it ever being disastrously inappropriate. Perhaps what I'm liking about the sound is more to do with these harmonics, however. Here's what gets added to a 100Hz tone. Subtle again, but definitely not so subtle that I doubt it will affect the sound. Note that the most prominent harmonic is the second at 200Hz, suggesting asymmetric saturation, which is exactly what I'd expect from real tubes. Even harmonics tend to sound sweeter and less audibly distorted than odd harmonics, and I would expect this kind of saturation to make most sources sound just a little bit better. Here's a Hammerstein graph showing that the second harmonic, shown here in red, remains the most prominent for the whole spectrum. Okay, let's talk about the style of compression provided. The two compressors have significantly different transfer curves, but they both do that typical vary-mu style thing, where it's basically all soft knee, and it's difficult to identify an actual threshold. The compression starts off super gentle, then the ratio increases very gradually as you ride further up the curve. You do eventually get to pretty high ratios, but the knee is so incredibly soft that this still sounds relatively gentle and, dare I say, musical. This is the kind of response I expected to find when I looked at the Rockruepel Comp.Two compressor recently, but didn't really. I was criticised under that video for using the rather nebulous and subjective term musical to refer to compression, but this compressor, or shall I say these compressors, are a great example of what I mean by that. Even when squashing a signal really hard, it doesn't seem to fight the musical intention. That doesn't mean you can't push it too hard, of course, but when you do, the result will be a general sense of mushiness and clutter, rather than, for example, disastrously choking the transients of your kick and snare. There are 3 attack time options. The differences are relatively subtle, but useful. The slowest setting allows a little more punch through, while the fastest tightens it up more. But there's no kind of audible choking with any of them. And 5 different release settings. Except these aren't really just release settings, they also affect the attack timing, Fairchild style. So the actual attack behaviour is determined by both this knob and the attack switch. A setting of 1 gives the fastest response, and 4 the slowest. The 2D settings combine a fast attack with a dual stage release. and in practice these tend to sound safer and more sedate. The more exciting settings, literally speaking, are at the faster end of the knob. But notice that the fastest setting can start to sound a little crunchy when you push it hard, especially with the attack switch set fast. There's also a high-pass filter for the sidechain. This makes a big difference to the compression, but it's set high enough at 150 Hz that it could still be a relatively gentle filter. Hard to say for certain, however, as there doesn't seem to be any way to listen to the sidechain directly. Let's talk about workflow then, and this is where I start to slide into my criticisms. We have an input gain and a threshold, no makeup gain as such. This is no big deal really. It might mean some iterative tweaking of threshold and gain, but that's kind of inevitable when setting up a compressor, whatever the control scheme. I wondered what these balance and meter parameters were for, but it seems they're not parameters, just decoration, I guess. Or rather, they're necessary on the hardware unit, because tubes and stuff, and therefore need to be included on the plug-in interface, because marketing, and never mind if that's confusing and counterintuitive. I'm not going to complain about the screws. I don't mind an occasional screw. Except for these two in the middle, because it turns out they're not screws, they're actually parameters. There's the makeup gain control that I initially thought was missing, plus a dry-wet mix, both so disastrously unusable that I'm likely to switch to the default Reaper interface whenever I want to tweak them. Seriously, we can do better than that. If the plug-in interface really must be a photorealistic copy of the hardware, give us an extra bar at the top or bottom for extra parameters such as dry-wet mix, so that they can be proper usable knobs or sliders. And if the hardware implements something potentially useful like a makeup gain control as a fiddly little trim pot, as this appears to do, please feel free to improve on that in the plugin with a proper gain control on that extra bar instead. I understand why developers want to make plugins that look like the expensive hardware they're modelling, and I don't criticise that per se, but it's only necessary to give the same flavour of interface. It really doesn't need to be a one-to-one copy, and the usability of the plugin in a real session should have a higher priority, in my opinion. While we're talking about usability, note that this in-out switch on the right is a bypass option, and so is the power switch on the left. I wondered at first if maybe the second one only bypassed the compression while leaving the saturation and box tone in place. But no, it doesn't. I checked the manual and double-checked in Plugin Doctor. These are duplicate options, which, in my opinion, only serves to massively increase the probability that you'll accidentally leave it in bypass when you don't mean to. Speaking for myself, I don't need any extra help making silly mistakes. I'm pretty good at it already. Obviously, a real hardware box full of valves will benefit from a bypass that leaves all those valves powered up and ready to go again. But it's okay to leave that switch off the plug-in version. I promise no one will mind. So there is more to say about this plugin, but due to some other questionable interface design choices, I missed that at first. So let's follow the same path my original demo took and move on to the other plugin, the Magic Death Eye Stereo. Wait a minute, you say. You've just been running a stereo mix through the non-stereo version. What's going on? Well, the non-stereo version is modelled on a mono hardware compressor. But the plug-in version is stereo because it's really just as easy for a plug-in to process 2 channels as it is to process 1. The stereo version is modelled on a different hardware compressor which has 2 channels for stereo operation and also different compression behaviour and a different feature set. The names make sense for the hardware, but are a bit confusing in the plugins. But I guess we're stuck with them because marketing. Anyway, the compression is very similar here, but somehow even more gentle and musical and transparent. We get all the same compression parameters, although the output gain is now a knob, which is welcome. The last 2 timing parameters are labelled 5 and 6 rather than dual, but still provide the same fast attack plus dual stage release behaviour. The high-pass filter is now apparently tuned even higher, up at 200 Hz. Perhaps that suggests they've used a gentler filter than the other compressor. Again, it's hard to say for certain, as I still can't find any way to listen to the sidechain directly. And we also have an option to link the gain reduction for the left and right channels, which is nice. Less nice, though, is the lack of any mid-side stereo options. This is kind of surprising in the hardware, to be honest, as it's explicitly inspired by the classic Fairchild designs, and the lateral and vertical, or mid and side options, are arguably one of the coolest features of a 670. But I suppose it would mean a lot of extra hardware controls to make it useful, as you ideally need to be able to dial in different compression settings for the two channels in that case. That wouldn't be a problem in a plug-in, however. Anyway, the stereo version seems to have a very similar box tone and adds very similar harmonics. But wait, we've got saturation. What about aliasing? Do we have any oversampling options? Looking at the interface, you wouldn't think so, but I thought I remembered reading it in the feature list, so I persevered. It didn't actually take me that long to discover that clicking the logo toggles 2 times oversampling, then 4 times, then back to the project rate. I feel like I was quite lucky to find this feature, to be honest, and don't find this very intuitive at all. I would definitely have missed it if I wasn't specifically looking for it, and even so I might not have thought to click there. Once again, the plugin could have been more intuitive and easier to use if it looked just a little bit less perfectly like the hardware. There's a bigger issue with the oversampling, however, and the first clue to that was the suspiciously small amount of latency that the plugin reports when oversampling is enabled. Checking in the Doctor reveals that, sure enough, this plugin uses minimum phase oversampling filters with a load of phase shift in the high frequencies as a consequence. This seems a strange choice, and partly because of the heritage of DDMF. This seems like a good time to talk about that, in fact. I think it's fair to describe DDMF as a small, independent developer. I get the impression it might be mostly or entirely a one-man operation. But this is no fly-by-night, upstart newcomer we're talking about. In fact, DDMF has been making plugins for many years, especially EQ plugins. I used to use his EQs regularly before the fab filters won me over with their interface style. The DDMF plugin catalogue includes linear phase EQs, multi-band compressors with linear phase crossovers, and the developer behind them is an experienced veteran who seems to know his DSP onions, and who also wrote Plugin Doctor, by the way. I'm going to assume that he's quite capable of coding up good quality linear phase oversampling filters, which suggests that the choice of minimum phase was a deliberate one, and it seems questionable to me. While it's true that most of the time this kind of phase shift is inaudible, sometimes it isn't, and it's definitely a problem if you want to run it in parallel. And the only advantage, as far as I'm aware, is the lower latency, which I don't really see as much of an advantage in a mixing or mastering context. Anyway, all of the above made me wonder if there was a similar hidden oversampling feature in the other, not stereo but not mono either version. Okay, are you ready? Drum roll. Oh, that's a bit disappointing. It's a 1970s sexism option. Except, annoyingly, it's not even that. Checking the parameter name tells us this time it's a punch setting. And yes, indeed, it does make the compression punchier in a potentially useful way. Which is super annoying because it means I will in fact be forced to turn it on and look at this tacky graphic. Don't get me wrong, I'm a red-blooded, hetero, cis male. I enjoy looking at the sexy ladies as much as the next guy. But can we assume that I've got those urges covered in other ways? And when I'm looking at a gain reduction meter, I just want to see gain reduction. And I'd prefer to be able to read the numbers, thanks very much. Okay, back to the stereo version. And there's a 2-band EQ available as well. Inductor-based, apparently, which made me wonder if there's more saturation modelled in there. Honestly, it's a bit hard to tell though. Here's a linear analysis of the low shelf. It's quite an interesting shape, although we should perhaps be a bit wary of it, as we know the plugin isn't actually linear, and the added harmonics might be skewing this measurement slightly. Here's a Hammerstein graph of the box tone with no EQ. And here's that low shelf boost again. It does look like those low harmonics bump up a little bit, so perhaps this is a subtly non-linear filter. It does sound nice, but why no cut option? Are you saying my mixes are bass light? Honestly, I don't think that's the case. I'm more likely to have to rein in the low end on my mix bus, in fact, than the opposite. But that's okay, I'm not short of options for that. I guess I can live without it here. The high boost comes with more surprises. It's not a shelf, for a start, it's a bell, Pultec style. And perhaps partly as a result, I found the limited frequency options a bigger problem than for the low shelf. I mean really, 5K or 12K and nothing in between? You don't think 8K might sometimes be important? I would much prefer a continuous control here, personally. But the biggest surprise comes up at the 18 kHz setting. That's cramping, right? Not what I expected from a developer with such a good reputation for EQ plugins. I know for sure it's cramping, because if I test at 96K, that 18K boost becomes much more symmetrical. But there's another surprise revealed in the form of another secondary boost about an octave higher, which itself looks cramped. I need to go up to 192 kHz to decramp that secondary boost. Though this is purely academic, of course. 2 times oversampling will be enough to fix any audible cramping in this or any other EQ. So what would I change to make this plugin perfect? Nothing about the basic sound or the compression behaviour. It's glorious and I love it. First of all, I would fix the interface. Get rid of the sexy lady for a start, or at least make it a separate option that doesn't affect the sound. Where there are hardware options that don't make sense, they should go. Honestly, no one will care. And any extra features should be clear and obvious, with properly labelled controls, not hidden away like Easter eggs in a computer game. While we're on the interface, this should really be resizable. I know that's a lot easier to say than to do, and to be fair, it's a pretty good fit for my laptop screen as it is, but there's such a huge range of different display sizes and resolutions that people might be working on these days that I think resizability has become kind of essential. Next, I would combine these both into a single plugin with a choice of 2 different compressor flavours. The marketing blurb suggests that the stereo version is intended for buses and mastering, while the non-stereo but actually stereo version is more for individual channels. But honestly, I think they both sound great on buses. They're just different. Both are, in my opinion, better suited to bus compression duties than the Rockruepel compressor I looked at recently, with its relatively hard 3:1 ratio behaviour. So I would really like to be able to set up one plugin on a bus, then toggle between the compressor styles to see which I like better. If this combined plugin were priced the same as the current Magic Death Eye bundle, that would still seem fair to me, as it would be more useful to me than 2 separate plugins. And you can have the interface change colour when you switch, if you really must. I don't care. Next, swap out the oversampling for a linear phase version. Or, if you have reasons to think minimum phase is preferable, provide an option for those who disagree. And finally, give us mid-side options, please. It's a VariMu for heaven's sake, that's half the fun. I don't care what the hardware does, I want the plugin to have the option anyway. If you want to know why I want the option, well, go back and watch my Comp.Two review. I go into some detail there, link below. I realise that means double the controls required, but I would be happy to switch between mid and side controls with some kind of tabbing arrangement, assuming there's some obvious visual cue to remind me which is currently selected, and that we get to see gain reduction meters for both channels at once. I also realise, of course, that there's nothing to stop me running mid-side compression using 2 instances and a couple of MS matrixing plugins. In fact, I'm anticipating doing so quite often, and will be saving that setup as a Reaper presets chain once my new computer is up and running. But this highlights my dilemma regarding which one to buy. While the stereo version is, maybe, arguably better suited to buses in terms of compression character, it's much less suited to use inside a mid-side matrix when you need 2 instances visible at once. I mean, that won't be a problem for me with 3 displays available, but if you're working on a single laptop screen, it might be. And I'll be brutally honest, if squeezing in the extra functionality I just asked for means you don't have room for those EQ controls in the stereo version, that's fine, they can go. I've got plenty of good EQ options. These aren't really flexible enough to be especially useful, and the sound of the compression is good enough that the deal doesn't need any further sweetening, in my opinion. Okay, I think that about wraps it up. Thanks for watching.